Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger, when both of you were younger and had much less capital for investing, which publications were the best to get the few excellent investment ideas to be so successful? And how many hours per week on average did you spend with reading about companies? Thank you.
When we were younger, we spent, probably Charlie compared to now, spent a lot more time. I spent a fair amount more time looking at companies. But we would, if we were doing it over again, we would do it over again pretty much the same way. We would look at everything in sight that we thought we could understand. And the world hasn't changed in that respect. There may be some more people doing it, but there are a lot more companies to look at now. And we would read everything in sight about the businesses and the industries we thought we could understand. We would look for things that jumped out at us as being very cheap in relation to value, and we would have one enormous advantage because we would be working with far less capital, which means the universe of potential ideas would be far greater. But there's nothing different, in my view, about analyzing securities now than there was 50 years ago. Charlie?
Yeah, we read a lot and we thought a lot. I don't know anybody who is wise who doesn't read a lot. And on the other hand, that alone won't do it. You have to have a temperament, really, which grabs the correct ideas and does something with those ideas. And I think most people who read a lot don't have the necessary temperament, and they grab the ideas or they're simply confused by the mass of material. And, of course, that won't work.
There's probably something. Phil Cray used to talk about having a money mind, and I would call it a business mind. And, there are people that are better with, identical IQs that are better adapted for one than the other. And the temperament is all important. I mean, if you can't control yourself, no matter what the intellect you bring to the process, you're going to have disasters. And Charlie and I have seen one after another that it's not a business that requires extraordinary intellect. It does require extraordinary discipline, and that shouldn't be so difficult. But as I look around the world, sometimes it apparently is quite difficult. I mean, the whole world went a little mad a few years back in terms of investments, and you say to yourself, how could that happen? Don't they learn anything from the earlier ones? But what we learn from history is that people don't learn from history, and you certainly see that in financial markets all the time. Incidentally, you mentioned books. Charlie, you didn't recommend any books this year?
One book I really like, I couldn't buy because it's published only in England, but it'll get here in due course. And that's called Deep Simplicity by John Gribben. It's a perfectly marvelous book. And, of course, that's a great title, Deep Simplicity. That's what we're all looking for.
I've been reading a short history of nearly everything, and it's very impressive to read about people pondering how to figure out the weight of the earth or something in the 18th century. And you would think minds that could do that would do very well in financial matters. But, if you remember, Isaac Newton spent a significant part of his life trying to turn lead into gold. And he might have made a good stockbroker, but it didn't do much for him financially. Charlie knows more about Isaac than I do. So
and he lost an enormous
the bubble
chunk of his net worth in the South Sea bubble. So he invested in an absolute crooked mania. And here was the smartest man in the world. So just IQ points alone won't do it.
Jonathan Mills from London, England. I wondered if you could comment on the views of those people who have stated that because of so-called conflicts of interest, you should leave the board of Coca-Cola, and whether you had any intention of doing so.
That we should do what with the board?
Leave the board. That you personally should leave the Coke.
I would say that whoever suggested that should do 500 sit-ups. Actually, Charlie and I, certainly I have, well, I'll let Charlie speak for himself. We like the idea and we've encouraged the idea of shareholders behaving like owners. I mean, shareholders have too often behaved like sheep in this country, and they got shorn in many cases. And big institutional shareholders have sat on the sidelines while some things that might possibly have been corrected had they gotten active took place. And so we actually applaud the idea of shareholders behaving like owners. The question is whether they can behave like intelligent owners. And I think that in the last year or two, as they've sort of woken up, they've searched for checklists of one sort or another to determine whether directors are appropriate in a given company or not. And frankly, checklists are no substitute for thinking. The real job of the directors is to come up with the right CEO for a company and prevent him or her from overreaching. If they do that job well, the rest takes care of itself. And you have to think some to determine whether that's taking place. You can't solve it by just running down a little checklist. I think it was Bertrand Russell who said, most men would rather die than think. Many do. And I think we've seen a little bit of what he was thinking about in some of the voting. I think it's absolutely silly, frankly. If Berkshire Hathaway owns 200 million shares of Coca-Cola, $10 billion worth, to not be able, it's a little silly not to think that the interest that Berkshire Hathaway has in selling some hours of training at flight safety or something would cause me to do something counter to the interests of the shareholders when we have $10 billion riding on that side of the table. I mean, it's almost absurd, and somebody doesn't understand proportionality at all when they come to that sort of conclusion. I also think it's absolutely foolish if, just to use Coca-Cola as an example, I think the directors of Coca-Cola haven't even looked, but I think we probably receive something like $100,000 a year. And if we were to go out into the welfare line and pick somebody out who has no income and say, we'd like you to become a director, and that person would get $100,000 a year, which would be their entire income. And to say that person would be independent, while they would be 100% dependent on their income, that person would be independent, whereas Berkshire Hathaway, or myself representing Berkshire Hathaway with $10 billion of stock and receiving the same $100,000 a year, is not regarded. So I encourage institutional shareholders and large owners to behave like owners, but I also encourage them to really think logically, as owners should think, in determining what causes they take on and how they vote. Charlie?
Yeah, I think that the corporate America needs a fair amount of reform, but the cause of reform is hurt, not helped, when an activist makes an idiotic suggestion like the one that having Warren Buffett on the board of the Coca-Cola Company is contrary to the interests of the Coca-Cola Company. Nutty activities do not help the cause for which the person speaks.
It's a little bit like having a slicing machine in an orchard where you're gathering together apples, but you're also picking up a lot of rocks in the process and sticks and stones. So you have a slicing machine with a conveyor belt, and the slicing machine is programmed so that every time something that's red and round comes down the line, it slices it and comes down, but it doesn't come down on the rocks and everything and ruin the blades. And of course, that's fine until a red balloon comes down the line, and then you get a big pop, and the machine has followed its little guidelines, but it's not slicing apples anymore. And I think actually institutions are coming new to really thinking about how they behave as owners, and you would hope that in the evolutionary nature of learning that not too many years distant, they would actually think about what's good for the shareholders of the company.